And thank you for the very fine opening statement. Let me begin by saying I'm intrigued by your thesis that the ratification process bears part of the blame for the Civil War, which is a connection that I've never made before, and I'm interested to hear more. Whose fault is it that slavery was not an issue during ratification and therefore set a precedent for, as I think you put it, skirting the issue?
Well, although they did discuss parts of slavery during the ratification debates, it really cannot be pointed to any one particular delegate, because all of the delegates coincidentally decided to only include those two minor clauses in the Constitution and to rather leave the issue of slavery ambiguous.
During the Constitutional Convention, I would say all of the delegates played a role in this neglect of the issue of slavery. During the convention itself, they were indecisive on how much they wanted to address the issue. The word slave is actually never mentioned in the Constitution. And once it came to ratification, it was such a delicate topic, especially considering the sectionalism considered during the convention, that it was wise not to touch it if the Constitution was ever going to be ratified.
The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were the two groups that were participating in the ratification debates, but they really weren't located in one geographical area. It wasn't like Pennsylvania was full of Anti-Federalists and Virginia was full of Federalists. Therefore, the Federalists knew during the ratification debates that if they were to bring up the issue of slavery, or even the Anti-Federalists knew that if they were to bring up the issue of slavery, they might lose an entire section of the country, which was important to the ratification debates in order to get the Constitution passed.
Can you tell us why the provision in the Articles of Confederation for amending the Articles was abandoned by the Constitutional Convention in favor of the state ratifying conventions? What's the motivation for that change?
The founders who met at the Philadelphia Convention were very concerned not only with the people, but with their own interests. Under the Articles of Confederation, their property was being seized, property rights were not very well protected, and therefore they figured that the way to protect their own interests and protect their economic interests was to make a stronger national government that could protect those individual interests.
In terms of the practical reasons for changing the ratification process, one, there was the idea of popular consent and the fact that one of the reasons why the Articles were perhaps not as successful as the Constitution was the fact that they were drawing their sovereignty from the states and not from the people. Secondly, it was simply more practical, because why would the state legislatures give up power to a body that was practically overthrowing them?
Additionally, as we actually see through the course of the ratification of the Constitution, several states, including and most notably Rhode Island, deferred their ratification for extended periods of time, even until after the other nine, or the first nine, had ratified it and created a functional government. It was only the pressure that was applied to Rhode Island by that pre-existing government in terms of economic sanctions that actually ended up causing them to join the Union.
I have a follow-up to that. How have amendments to the Constitution been adopted? Did they follow the precedent set by the Constitutional Convention, or did they go in a different direction?
Amendments to the Constitution have followed the precedent that ratification sent in terms of sending them to special conventions instead of the state legislatures.
Also, it's important to note that the amendment process is slightly different than the Constitutional Convention, since every time an amendment was called for, the actual legislation that governs our body was not completely rewritten.
Why do you think that the framers sent the Constitution to the states with neither an endorsement nor a condemnation? Was this a wise decision? Why or why not?
I would argue that it was a wise decision not to condemn the Constitution or support it prior to sending it to the states, because it did enhance this civil discourse in which the states were able to discuss what parts of the Constitution they agreed with and what parts they didn't, without being biased beforehand.
I would respectfully disagree with my colleague and say that while the body as a whole did not condemn or support the Constitution, the individuals who attended the convention were very active in promoting either the passage of the Constitution or whether or not they wanted it to fail.
Specifically, immediately following the close of the convention, I believe George Washington circulated a letter to other key officials in several states urging them to ratify the Constitution. Edmund Randolph, who did not sign the Constitution and was seemingly an anti-federalist at the end of the convention, appeared to switch sides before the Virginia ratification. He was supposed to rally support against the Constitution, and he failed to do so, which one could argue ultimately led to the Virginia ratification.
In your opening, you also mentioned that the ratification process set precedents not just for our country, but internationally as well. And are those direct effects that we can trace in particular situations, particular instances?
Excuse me, although that you cannot maybe directly relate the ratification process that we had back in the early 1800s to what we have today, we can see one precedent or one example with the EU and how they ratified their constitution with the states by giving each of the states and each of the people within that state the opportunity to ratify the constitution, which was very similar to our own ratification process.
Another key with ratifications, immediate or more closely following the American ratifications, such as the French in 1791 and the Spanish in 1812, is that the mechanism of state conventions that America used, because it was geographically large, was not necessarily viable in a country as small as France or Spain. They actually ratified their constitutions through parliamentary bodies that were nationally elected. This maintained the ideals of popular sovereignty, as the people did elect those representatives.
But that's actually very different, isn't it? That would be like having the Constitution ratified by Congress without letting it be approved by direct referendum or conventions established specifically for that purpose.
It is, although it did espouse many of the same ideals that we have. Perhaps a clearer example would be the Australian ratification constitutions. Between the period of 1898 and the 1900s, they sent out parts of their constitution to the general population and got direct referendums from the people in order to pass their national constitution.